アメリカ・ワシントンにある FRB 連邦準備制度理事会の本部前です。こちらは現在柵が張り巡らされまして大規模な改修工事中です。もともと川沿いの地盤が弱い湿地に建てられていることなどからその改修費用は25億ドル、およそ3670億円に上ります。これに対しトランプ大統領が猛烈に批判しています。FRB のパウエル議長が先導する形で今トランプ大統領が FRB 本部の視察に姿を現しました。パウエル議長から何か説明を受けています。現職大統領の FRB 本部の訪問は異例です。直接乗り込んで圧力をさらに強めます。
We're just taking a look at what's happening. It's a tough construction job. They're building basements where they didn't exist or expanding them, and a lot of very expensive work. There's no question about it.
こうした本部の改修費用のほか、利下げを見送っている FRB への批判を強めているトランプ大統領。そこで構想として持ち上がっているのが FRB の理事に利下げを推進する人物を次の議長候補として送り込む影の議長構想です。去年6月までクリーブランド連銀の総裁を務め、FOMC 連邦公開市場委員会にも10年にわたって参加したロレッタ・メスター氏にインタビューしました。影の議長がもたらす影響のほか、今後の金融政策の見通しについても聞いています。
Trump administration has been openly criticizing Chair Powell, claiming that interest rates should be cut soon and that Chair Powell should resign.
The FOMC bases its policy decisions on what it views in its judgment and with its analysis is best for reaching the mandated goals that it was given by Congress, which is maximum employment and price stability. And so they're going to continue to do that work and that analysis and base their decisions on sound economic, analysis and their balancing of the risks to both mandated goals. But it does complicate things in the sense that means they have to spend time explaining to the public and to market participants that that's how they go about doing their job rather than being directed by the President of the United States or any external influence. So it's a complication, but it doesn't change the actual decision-making process. The unfortunate thing about it, though, is, as you point out, is that it presents this uncertainty about how the Fed is going to make its decisions. So it doesn't really change the decision-making process, but it certainly adds some uncertainty to it in the minds of the public and financial markets, and that can have a detrimental effect.
In such a situation, what is the impact that concerns you the most?
The danger, if you take that away, is that monetary policy decisions could become influenced by short-run political considerations. And, a politician's time frame is short-run. In other words, a lot of times, a politician might want to gin up the economy by setting interest rates very low in order to boost the economy, perhaps before an election. And that's not good monetary policy because that'll end up with higher inflation in the future. Politicians also may want to have low interest rates in order to make it easier to fund government deficits and making it easier to handle the cost of high government debt. And so that's also dangerous because that means that they don't face the tough decisions of how to get their fiscal situation in order.
This is not the first time the Federal Reserve's independence has been challenged. Do you think situations like this tend to happen from time to time, or is the current administration's approach particularly unusual or unique?
I think you're right to point out that this isn't the first time a president of the United States has commented on monetary policy. What I view as different this time is the persistence with it. It hasn't been a one-time thing. It's been very persistent. And also the vitriol and the language and the intensity of the criticisms. So it is different, but in more particular, it's different because this president has intimated that he might fire the chair of the Fed.
When it comes to controlling inflation, which scenario would be more effective? A Federal Reserve that maintains its independence, or one where that independence is compromised?
Well, certainly having an independent central bank making monetary policy decisions will focus better on the inflation and maximum employment part of the mandates. And so I think you get better outcomes if you have an independent decider in a central bank. And I think that's what the research supports, right? There's been many years of research, both in advanced economies and in economies that are developing economies or emerging market economies. And the research says that when you have independent monetary policy decision making, you get lower stable inflation. And so that I think leads to better outcomes. And I think that's why this is a time for really reflection and hopefully will maintain the independence of the central bank. So again, trying to influence the Fed and take away independence is not something that the markets want. And when I was on the FOMC, you'd routinely talk to legislators, especially from your district. And all the legislators I talked to were in favor of maintaining an independent Federal Reserve. So again, neither the government, other than the current administration, nor the financial markets, I don't think they would react well to trying to take away that independence.
So, if a candidate favored by President Trump, specifically someone inclined to pursue aggressive rate cuts and the political agenda, what do we point at as the Fed chair? What potential problems could arise?
So anybody put in the seat of being a chair of the Federal Reserve has to have credibility with the public, the financial markets, and the rest of the committee, the Federal Open Market Committee, who sets monetary policy. So that person can't just do what someone else tells them to do. He or she has to do the analysis, be able to come up with what is a good case and rationale for whatever policy path they want to make. If that isn't true and someone is put in there and can't make a credible case, then they lose credibility. The committee might lose credibility if they don't stand against that. And that can be very detrimental to the financial markets. Financial markets might, in turn, have to put on a higher inflation risk premium on long-term interest rates. So the irony is that forcing interest rates to be short-term interest rates, which is what the Federal Reserve sets to be too low, inappropriately low, can actually lead to higher longer-term interest rates because investors will demand a higher return on long-term debt in order to hold it. And so that's why this kind of going back and forth and trying to cajole the Fed into lowering interest rates may be very counterproductive in terms of what President Trump said he wants, which is lower longer-term interest rates.
トランプ大統領などが検討しているのが2026年1月に任期を迎えるクグラー理事の後任として影の議長を送り込む構想です。この影の議長が実現したとしてトランプ氏の思惑通りに進めることができるのでしょうか。
So that is standard operating procedure. And he could very well put in someone that he later nominates as the Fed chair. That's fine. The question will be, how will the committee react if that person starts to try to lead the decision-making process? But I don't think that'll happen. I think the chair of the Fed, is the one who tries to drive the consensus on the committee. And I don't think that will change, even if someone is put in who later becomes the next chair. And I think Jay Powell will serve as chair very effectively and be the one that the rest of the committee looks to for driving the consensus and putting out the plan of sort of what the case is. And the way that works is you come into that room and sit at that FOMC table with your best ideas about what's the best policy path forward in order to meet those dual mandate goals. And that's very important. And you listen to your colleagues, and it's basically the best arguments win. If somebody comes in with a different perspective or different viewpoint, right, your job is to really do the analysis that can support your view on monetary policy, and you stick to that. And occasionally you might have to dissent from the consensus if you don't think it's the right path forward for monetary policy. And I've dissented in my career at the Fed, and others did as well. And that's not going to change, right? What I do believe will happen is that the person coming in will feel the responsibility of being in that chair as chair of the Federal Reserve, and they will have to bring their best analysis to the table too. So that, and the fact that that person is going to have to convince the rest of the committee, right, is sort of the guardrails of keeping the committee focused on long-term monetary policy goals and not being diverted by short-run political considerations.
Governor Chris Waller is being mentioned as a possible Fed chair. Recently, he has become more dovish, and market thinks he may want the job.
Chris is a very good economist, and he's doing the evaluation that he thinks is correct. I happen not to agree with his rationale. My view would be that you wouldn't want to cut in July. The economy is very strong right now. Labor markets are about at full employment or maximum employment in balance. And inflation, while it hasn't shown much impact from the tariffs yet, is expected to move up. And we're starting to see that in some goods prices. It may be a set of rolling of tariffs. We still don't know what the ultimate tariffs will be. So there's no compelling reason to cut yet, because the real side of the economy is quite strong and the employment part of the mandate is being met, and there's inflation risk. So to my mind, the better path would be to keep interest rates where they are and let more time go through so you can see the impacts on tariffs on both sides of the mandate going forward. Well, I think right now you're right in pointing out that the pass-through of the tariffs we've seen so far has been pretty minimal and less than people might have expected at this point. But a couple of things to think about. One, a lot of firms brought in inventories to try to get ahead of the tariffs, but those inventories are being worked down, and anything they're bringing in now that has a higher tariff, they will plan to pass at least some of that on to consumers. The second piece of information is that the Beige Book, those Beige Book results said that across every district, firms are reporting that they're planning to raise their prices because of the tariffs. So I think that we will see an increase in prices, more than what's in the June report. And the question will be, will that be more persistent? And it could be more persistent if it raises the inflation expectations of consumers once they start seeing those prices rising. So right now, there's uncertainty about how much inflation will rise. And that's what the Fed has to evaluate is, will it be persistent, which means they can't look through it, or will it be a one-off increase in prices that they can look through?
The company is holding back on raising prices. Is it possible that inflation will not accelerate until after this summer, making it harder to assess in the short term?
So I do think that it's going to be a drawn out process because different firms brought in different levels of inventories. So we could see this play out over time. And secondly, we could see it play out over time because we don't know the ultimate level of tariffs. We've seen sort of tariffs been put on, take off, the on-off nature, and then new tariffs. So that drags out the process. So I do think the process may take a little longer than a textbook put on a higher tariff, prices adjust instantaneously, we're done. It could very well take longer to play out.
But President Trump sent a letter to Chair Powell. He even suggested the rates should be brought down to levels closer to Japan's. It is below 1%.
Well, inflation in the U.S. is still above the Fed's goal of 2%. It had been starting to move down before the tariffs were announced, and there was concern about, tariffs raising prices. But a 1% interest rate in the U.S., as President Trump is advocating, is an emergency interest rate, right? It's well below what most economists think is, right, a neutral interest rate. The analysis would suggest that you wouldn't want that to happen, that that would be a bad interest rate for the economy where it stands today. It could generate overheating and it could generate much higher inflation going forward, and we want to avoid that.
So you have long been known as hawkish. If you were still at the table, what would your position be regarding the policy rate?
Yes, there's signs that the employment is moderating in the United States, but that was expected to happen this year. And I don't think that it's weakening enough that you'd want to start to cut rates again, given there's risk on the inflation side. But come September, there'll be a lot more data to assess, a couple more employment reports, a couple more inflation reports. And I think at that time, you'd have to take a look to see where the economy's going, how firms are reacting to higher tariffs, whether there are more deals being made with lower tariff rates than currently on the table. But I still think that the risk here is on inflation, given it's been high for quite a long time. And you do not want the Fed to prematurely lower interest rates and give up all the great gains that they made on getting inflation back down to where it is today.
Latest June, Fed dot plot suggests 2 rate cuts by the end of the year. Do you consider these 2 rate cuts reasonable?
So whether it be 0, 1, or 2, I think we can't determine that today because we really don't know. There's still a lot of uncertainty around how the tariffs are going to play out. What I think they're hoping is that we get back to where we were a year ago, right? Where, in September of last year, the Fed felt comfortable enough that inflation was on that downward path, gradual downward path to 2%, that they could begin taking away some of the restrictive policy. At this point, it's hard to determine whether they will be able to be in a position to begin lowering rates again or not. And different forecasts will differ. So I think you can make a reasonable case that you could cut twice. I think you can make a very reasonable case you might want to start cutting once towards the end of the year. But we can't tell that today. We just have to see how the economy evolves.